Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing our journey through the Tao Te Ching. And we are in chapter 76 today. So very excited about that one. It's one of my favorite chapters. All right, let's get started. So we're looking at the Addiss and Lombardo translation. And we'll just jump right in here. Humans are born soft and weak. So we've seen uh, a lot of discussion throughout the Daodejing about the uh, importance of, we could say, flexibility with this idea of softness and weakness, and how often it's seen as something that is underrated in more conventional thinking, but they'll bring up all kinds of examples of where this is actually a positive thing. And they also like to tie it into um, a connection with infants in the sense that they have not yet been, in a sense, co-opted by the culture, that they're still more innocent and behaving more naturally. And so there's a couple of different realms of thought that are coming together, even in this opening line, of bringing us back to that more soft, supple, flexible, unencumbered by cultural understanding that is a part of this idea of when humans are born. But they're specifically highlighting the idea here of softness and weakness. And then it's going to contrast that. It says they die stiff and strong. And so this isn't strong in terms of like muscular strength, although maybe there could be a way that that gets tied in, but I think it has more to do with the idea of a corpse, right? That it becomes stiff and maybe even instead of strong, you could think of almost like this brittleness, right? That there's an unbending and unyielding aspect to how the human body ends up at the end. And then it's going to make a comparison. So it says the 10,000 plants and trees. Although in the actual Chinese, it still says the 10,000 things. And then it also says plants and trees. And so it's kind of a question. Do they mean the 10th of the 10,000 things, the plants and trees, or the 10,000 things and the plants and trees, or the 10,000 plants and trees, as it says here? But what I think is happening is it's making a connection with, in a sense, the two main areas of life, right? So you've got animal life and you've got plant life. So the humans, I think, are symbolic of all like animal life. And that here is talking about all the plants and trees. So it's everything that's alive as opposed to just the, including things like mountains and rocks and that kind of thing. So it says, in this case, plants and trees are also born soft and tender and die withered and sere. And I had to look up that word sere. I wasn't familiar with that one, but it sounds like it's another way of saying essentially withered or dried up for plants. Have you guys heard that term before?
No, I've heard seer as in Seer, which is totally different, but I don't think I've ever heard Sere, seer.
Yeah, sometimes I guess it's also spelled Sear.
I think
Uh,
it's kind of an archaic
Oh,
term,
could
like
be.
for a sear desert.
Mm, yeah, I don't know. It's a
Sear? I've heard that when it comes to like cooking. I
yeah, it's
don't know if that's the same
interesting.
though.
Those poets, they like to pull out those words for you. Uh,
Yeah.
but yeah, so again, we have the same kind of contrast, right? That essentially it's saying animal life as well as plant life, everything starts off soft and tender or has this flexibility, but then it dies, withered and dried up, right? So I think it's also interesting that they continue to make an analogy between humans and other aspects of nature. This is an area that is often lacking in more Western thinking, where humans are somewhat divorced from nature and seen as outside of it, or kind of a guest in nature, right? So this is just another reminder that for the Taoist mind, and probably the Chinese thought in general at this point, humans are an aspect of nature. They're not separate from it. They're a part of it. And so here, everything is being recognized, that all living things, whether we're talking about animals or plants, go through this process, and they start off one way and they end up another way at the end. And it's probably important to note again that this isn't necessarily like trying to state a more perfect and a worst way. It is, two ends of this yin yang, that is this cycle that everything goes through. And it's not that it's wrong or bad that things end up dying, but there's indications of when something is in that phase, we could say. Right. And there's indications when it's on the other side of things, when things are just starting off. What do they look like versus what do they look like when they're coming to an end? So it's not making a value judgment per se here. It's just recognizing that there's this pattern, and that this pattern goes along with certain characteristics that help us to maybe, in a sense, identify the different phases. So how do we know we're at the beginning or that growth phase? Well, because things are flexible and they bend and they're soft and all this kind of stuff. And how do we know when it's coming to a close? It becomes unbending or unyielding and stiff. That's when we know it's about to come to its close. So then it says the stiff and strong are death's companions. Now, this word that's translated as companions here has a variety of ways that it's translated, and more than a few of the translations translate this as disciple. So it would read that the stiff and strong are disciples of death. It could also be translated as followers. So there's this, again, correlation between a certain way of being and where you are on that cycle between life and death. And it's saying that these characteristics of stiff and strong are characteristic of what's leading towards, or it's this idea of following, or potentially even disciples of death, which is just a really powerful thought. And then the opposite, the soft and weak, then are disciples of life, or life's companions, or followers of life. And I think this is, for me, one of the stronger statements that I think the Tao Te Ching makes, in terms of, wouldn't say picking a side, but in terms of trying to make a call to action, in a sense, right? Like, what way do you want to be in this world? How are you going to function? Are you going to go down this road of trying to hold on to things and not change and be unbending and unyielding? Or are you going to practice more of that flexibility and that softness and that bendableness, right? That agility, maybe. And it has two different directions that those are going to lead to. So because everything is constantly in transition, the problem with stiff and strong is, in terms of actions, in terms of a way of being, is it tends to want to hold on to things to keep them from transitioning, to keep them from changing. Even if it's something like trying to hold on to life, it's like it tends to corrupt things, because everything has to stay in motion. Everything is constantly changing. So to try and stop it is, and a consequence of that is really to kind of bring about its end. On the flip side, being this flexible, they use like the image of like the young plant in a storm, right? That it can be blowing like crazy and the plant can bend a great deal, and then when the rain is done, it just kind of springs back up. But an old tree that's very hard and strong, it can actually, it won't bend, it'll just break, and then it's done. So this, I think, is fascinating given our current uh, situation in the United States. So this is being recorded as the first of our classes after the election, or re-election, I should say, of Donald Trump. And we are definitely in a very polarized state with our country at the moment. And it's interesting to see how everybody is, in a sense, reacting to and dealing with this situation. And also, I think, how we got to this situation. So we had very vehement language on both sides that were essentially demonizing the other side. That if both sides were saying that if the other side wins, it's the end of everything. And this is just not a helpful way of stating things for people, because then everybody's got so much invested in this that they're just like devastated if their side isn't the one that won, and maybe overly glib on the other side if theirs is the side that won. But I think it requires us to really think, because there was a big, I mean, it was a, even though the side that won had both the electoral votes, also had the popular vote, but it was not by like a huge amount. Like it was still very split in terms of even where the popular vote went. And it's interesting then to think, how is it that both sides could be so removed from the other side when we're talking about half of the country, and this is a large country, right? Like, how could people be so distant from each other in terms of being able to see their perspective or understand where they're coming from? And I think this stuff that we're talking about right here has a lot to do with that, that there are uh, reactions on both sides to change, and both sides were doing their utmost to lock in their position and to make it not change. And so if we think about this idea of soft and weak versus stiff and strong, and how we respond to the current situation, whichever side of the fence you fall on, I think it gives us some interesting things to think about, at least from a Taoist perspective, and how would we respond to something like this? And maybe before I give some of my thoughts on that, and not trying to get into particular political positions, but rather dealing with the challenge of being in such a radically polarized political situation, in terms of that polarization, what is your take on how the Taoist would encourage us to navigate such a thing? Again, not with getting into like particular issues, but just the fact of the polarization.
I actually couldn't wait until this this week because I don't know and I want to know. Like Wednesday morning, I just was like, how would a a Taoist deal with this? Like, how would we be advised to deal with something like this? And I don't know. I think it would be like a go with the flow kind of thing. Like a little bit of what I talked about last week was like, what can you control? And one of the big things that you can control most of the time is your perspective and the way that you see things and react to them. And I feel like it would be something along those lines if I had to guess, but I feel like I don't really know.
Mhm.
Well,
Dane, you have any thoughts?
yeah, one thing I think that's in alignment with the principles of Taoism is just like you don't don't celebrate your victories too much and don't mourn your defeats too much. As in, don't identify too much with either victory or defeat. I think a typical Taoist would refrain from identifying too much with either side of a dichotomy or a duality. Um, so I think about when I was little and my dad would be watching ball games on television, and I'd watch for a little while, and I'd kind of get like identified with one of the teams, and I'd feel good whenever that team scored, and I'd feel bad when the other team scored, and eventually I was, wait, what difference does it make to me? They're just, I don't have anything to do with either one of these. It's just a game. So I noticed that feeling of kind of like getting pulled into one side of a thing that really is kind of identifying with one side of a pretty much completely arbitrary dichotomy in that case. Of course, when it comes to politics, a lot of people take it very personally and feel it very personally, which is why I say avoid getting too identified. Maybe there is some identification, but there's still a realization that um, that you are not just one side of the dichotomy. So it's not, so it doesn't feel like your side loses or wins. It's just an ongoing dialectic. And the other thing is I think the first thought that went through my mind when I saw the results of the election was like, well, I guess we'll see. I guess I had the image of like almost like a seesaw or a teeter totter tipping to one side, and I'm like, well, there's going to be a reaction to that. Let's see what happens. Like either Trump's going to destroy the country and everybody's going to realize, uh, or he'll create some kind of utopia in the next 4 years and everybody else is going to realize, or life goes on and people will go on arguing about what really like what the actual consequences were. Um, but the timeline of history will continue one way or another. It
Mm-hmm.
was just like, well, okay, this happened. I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see how the bow rocks in response to this perturbance.
Yeah. And for people who are watching may not be familiar with the reference to the we'll see, there's a Taoist parable that talks about a farmer whose horse runs away, and initially everybody thinks that this is a horrible thing, and then the horse comes back with some companions, and this is a big benefit for the farmer, so everybody thinks it's a good thing. And then his son is trying to break in one of the new horses and falls off and breaks his leg, and again they think it's a bad thing. But then the government comes through conscripting all the kids, and he can't go because he had a broken leg. And so they celebrate it as a good thing. And it's this flip-flopping of the evaluation of whether something is good or bad or fortunate or unfortunate that shifts with the perspective of time. And the idea is that we're never at the end of the story, so we don't know how it's going to ultimately play out. And the farmer just constantly responds with the refrain, we'll see. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Well, we'll see. And I think it definitely is applicable in a situation like this as well. One of the things that in thinking about, especially like these two verses here or lines.
Can I just add one more thing too, Jim? To that
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
I mentioned the second Bush presidency earlier. I remember actually very similar kinds of sentiments being expressed uh, when George Bush Jr. was running for president the first time, and particularly the second time. And I remember having friends that when he was elected the second time, and I was like, "Oh my God, it's the end of the world. We're all doomed." And so uh, I also kind of have the benefit of that historical perspective that that
We've
there's
here before.
there's always people who kind of respond like Chicken Little, and we're all still here. Imagine that.
Yeah, there's a guy online, Michael Shermer, who heads up the Skeptic magazine, and he has a podcast that he interviews people frequently. And he had a little social commentary that I think came out actually a little bit before the election. And it said, the most important election of my lifetime again. And he basically steps through like what it was like with the campaign with Nixon and what happened with Reagan and on, and about how each of these things was seen as such a catastrophic, choice and disaster, and how, here we are and we're kind of going through the same thing again. So
And
yeah,
also realizing how little power and influence the position of the president actually has. There's so many moving parts to the whole thing that it's uh there's there's many forces at play
yeah,
beyond just who holds one particular position.
correct. And there are some, checks and balances, but that's not to say that people haven't done, things that maybe we would evaluate as better or worse over the course of their presidencies. But in thinking about from a Taoist perspective, and specifically with the passage that we're looking at, my initial thinking on this was everybody on both sides is saying of the other side that you're the companion of death, that you're the disciple of death, right? That on the conservative side, they're worried that the Democrats were bringing about an end to democracy. And ironically enough, the Democrats were saying that the Republicans were bringing about an end to democracy. So they're both claiming the same thing about the other side, which is interesting, even though they were approaching it from very different perspectives. And it's not to say that there weren't, real concerns and things to be to recognize in terms of critiques of both sides. And I think that's really what I'm hoping will happen, is that this is going to cause more of a reflection rather than a digging in of the trenches. Because can we really say that half of the population is just delusional on either side, right? Or is it possible that we've just been rallied into such extreme positions that we're incapable of seeing the other side, and that maybe the other side has some valid issues or concerns that they want to address? And this is where I think, from the Taoist perspective, it would be that if we are thinking about our actions, how are we going to be that disciple of life, that companion of life that is going to have that flexibility? And part of what's going to be required there is to recognize we're dealing with big extremes on where we are on this kind of yin yang spectrum. But yet, each side, if we're paying attention to how yin yang works, feeds into the other, and it eventually transforms as well. And there's been some very curious things where, a lot of topics that tended to be more on the Democratic side have seemed to kind of migrate to the Republican side, and vice versa. I mean, there's just some really interesting sociologically just shifts that have happened in realignments. And so I think that
Especially over the long term, Jim, because I mean, going back to the founding of the country, there were the Whigs and the Tories that sort of represented, you might say, what we would now call conservative or progressive ideologies, and it was the founding of the Democratic and Republican parties. I mean, the Democrats originally were the ones that wanted to keep slaves, if you go back far enough. So
yeah.
The sort of parts of the political spectrum that the parties identify with, I've noticed exactly what you're talking about, just in particularly in the last few years, that it seems like a lot of things that would have when I was younger would have seemed to be the concern of like the progressive or left part of the political spectrum have now become more like concerns of the right part of the political spectrum. I've been noticing that shift happening.
Yeah, it's an interesting landscape. And I guess, during this cycle, I was really intentionally working to try and understand more from both perspectives, where they were coming at. And I wasn't honestly extremely excited about either prospect, but I wanted to try and understand what was going on in terms of the mindsets of both sides. And one of the things I would just say that what I would hear a lot, let's say on the left, of a critique was more specifically, often not totally, but often about the person of Donald Trump and some of the different character traits that they found, hugely objectionable. And there was this thought that somehow the people who were supporting the Republican side were supporting these bad character traits. Like the reason that they wanted to elect him is because they thought that all those other people in the country were racist or misogynistic or whatnot, right? Whereas the people who, at least the ones that I've come across and the things that I've listened to, it wasn't those the things that the left didn't like about Donald Trump are not the reasons why the people on the right were voting for him. It was like they were just seeing right past each other. I don't think anybody would argue too much about like the character of the person, but that wasn't the reason that they were actually voting for him. And I found that very interesting because it prevented the dialogue from happening because you're arguing about two different things. And probably similar on the other side where there was a lot of stuff that was made about character attacks on Kamala and versus what people on the left were actually voting for was not about that, right? The person has an image, obviously, and is a figurehead for each of the parties, but ultimately the issues that people are concerned about aren't necessarily about that particular person or trying to promote that particular person's character traits. They just happen to be the person who represents the side. And so I think the first thing is to break out of this idea that everything is fixed. So if we think about that stiff and strong, it's the idea that we're holding tightly onto a particular idea that we're trying to not let change. That's impossible. And this is a problem on both sides where everybody is wanting to keep something from changing that they feel like is changing. And it's very disruptive or creates a sense of disequilibrium when it feels like the tides are shifting. So from the Taoist perspective, the first thing would be to let go a little bit because you can't force things to stay one way or the other. And then the other would be to have more of a sense of trying to understand the other person or the other side, as opposed to just putting them into this box that you think this is who they must be if they're doing this. Because what I found anyway is that that's frequently not the case. And it just doesn't make any sense the way that it had been so radically drawn, this gap between the two sides. With so many people, that's just not possible. So there's a lot of labeling that's been going on that really needs to be kind of deconstructed, and we need to kind of get back to, well, who are each other, right? And what are the concerns that they actually have, and how can we try to understand their perspective? And I think this is where that disciple of life, that companion of life, that flexibility comes into play, because the more we can actually understand each other, the more we can try to find common ground or ways that we can work together to bring about something that's going to be more beneficial for everyone. And of course, this is an easy thing to say, and it's hard to like, how do we play this out in reality? But at least at an individual level, if we can withhold from buying into the fear mongering that creates this extreme emotional reaction and just try to settle down for a moment personally to try and understand what's going on. Because, you could pick any of the big issues. And of course, one of the big ones this time around was the abortion question, or more broadly, women's rights kinds of questions. But there was a lot of women on the right and on the left. So how could it be, right, that the way they frame the argument and the way they create this like fear-mongering stuff, it seems impossible to imagine that there could ever be somebody that's of the same sex on the other side. But obviously there is, and quite a bit. So there must be something missing in how we're looking at the picture if we are if it seems completely incredulous to us, how somebody could possibly think like the other person does, we probably have a caricature of what's going on instead of the reality. And so I think that's where this we will see kind of perspective comes into play, where this, being flexible and trying to understand part of it comes into play, where this our own attempts to hold on to things and not let things change needs to be evaluated so that we can hopefully have a broader perspective and a clearer perspective of what actually is. And I think if we can find some way to do that, that there will be ways that we can find more common ground on things. And it's not that we all have to agree. And this is maybe the bigger point that the Taoists would make is it's not about conformity. We don't get to where we need to be by getting everybody to be the same. This is the problem of the carved wood. The carved wood says, here's all these boxes that everybody belongs in, and to fit somebody in that box, we got to chop them up, we got to carve them, make them fit in order for the system to work. And the Taoists are saying no, that we need to have the ability to embrace the uncarved wood, the natural state of things, and allow for the differences to coexist. So we're striving for more of the sense of harmony, where the differences are actually a positive thing that add to a greater whole than it would be just by the individual parts. So it's not about getting everybody to agree or everybody have the same opinion. We all have different life experiences and things that are important to us that we can learn from each other and benefit from those differences so we can create more of a harmonious relationship as opposed to trying to enforce a conformity. So those are just some basic thoughts, I guess, that I had. I don't know if you guys have any follow-up thoughts on that.
Another
It's
example of a yin yang dynamic that's at play would be one that I think I mentioned previously about there's the drive to differentiate and there's the drive to integrate
mm,
that sort of stay in balance with each other. So um, there there are in any group there are sort of forces working to bring them together and forces working to uh, separate them. Sort of like in the nucleus of an atom, you have the electromagnetic force that wants to push everything apart, and you have the strong nuclear force that pulls everything together, and there's a kind of a balance. Or in a star, there's a force of gravity that's causing it to collapse inwards, and there's a force of fusion that's pushing outwards, and it kind of keeps things in balance. So um, there are there are larger trends of integration and differentiation that are sort of playing out over much larger scales, over much longer time periods, and I think really for me the Taoist perspective is just seeing that dance, seeing the yin and the yang in everything, seeing how everything is sort of an interplay between uh, complementary forces that don't stay in like a fixed static equilibrium, but they do this sort of back and forth thing where one will come to predominate in a way and then the other becomes stronger and starts to predominate, and there's this ongoing dance. And another one of those dualities is uh, the and which is kind of related in a way is the um, you can see conservatism as sort of valuing the rights of the individual higher than the well-being of the collective, and the liberal perspective is being sort of putting more emphasis on the collective well-being higher than the individual. And of course both are important and necessary. Neither one can ultimately be valued more than the other, because individuals can't thrive in an unhealthy collective, and a collective can't be healthy if it's made up of unhealthy individuals. And then there's also, with respect to change, there's certain traditional things that have been working in the conservative perspective is more kind of keep these things that we already know work, and the liberal or progressive perspective is more emphasizes, well, there's a lot of stuff that doesn't work, then it's broken, it needs to be fixed and changed, let's throw out the old and bring in the new stuff. And obviously neither one of those can ultimately predominate, because things can't stay the same forever, things are changing. And at the same time, if we there are things that are working to keep us alive and functioning as a society, as it were, and if we throw out those things, then we may end up causing more harm than good. So seeing these kind of perspectives as like interplays with these larger forces that play out over larger time scales, larger domains, and larger time scales, um, helps to see it as more of like an ongoing dance
Mm,
between complementary principles.
yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. I go back to 2016, and what was interesting with Bernie at the time, I had remarked that what was driving Bernie was the same thing. The populist movement behind Bernie was the same thing that was driving Trump, and it was that both sides were dissatisfied with the status quo, right? And there was huge movements on both sides, and I think the different parties' reaction to that was interesting, because on the left, they did everything they could to basically stomp out the possibility of somebody like Bernie, moving forward or having a possibility of winning, because it was, for the left, that was kind of an existential threat, right? And it was going to really upset a lot of where the Democratic Party had gotten to at that time. And I'm guessing, and this is just pure speculation on my part, that on the right, nobody thought it was possible that Trump would actually win. And so they didn't really do a lot to try and stop him, right? Like they just thought, well, this is just not going to happen. But then by not addressing it, the unthinkable happened, and he actually won, because everybody thought it was too much of a joke. It wasn't going to actually happen. And then it did happen. And so you had more of this populist movement that was driving both sides actually materialize on the right side, and was squelched on the left side. And I think it's a lot of that dissatisfaction with the status quo that was driving the extremes on both sides that maybe had more of a coalescing than on the right, because it was the only party that was, at least in some sense, looked like it was responding to this populist response. But it's a very interesting path to follow from 2016 to the 20 to the 24, about how the cycle of going back and forth is just interesting, but it for sure is representative of a massive change in terms of how the general populace is looking at our situation as not being satisfied with it. And like, to Dane's point, how does that change then happen? Is it something where we throw the baby out with the bathwater and maybe we end up with, more chaos than we started with? Or is it something where there's a possibility of bringing about real reform and how these things unfold? And I guess, we're going to just have to, again, we'll see how this particular iteration is going to unfold. It appears that, the main things that you know presidents complain about is that they have to battle with either the Senate or the House or both, and it looks like they might both be Republican in this place. So there really won't be any excuses from this administration about not having those things, or being able to blame it on those things. So and then, of course, there's the midterm elections coming up. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in this first 2 years, in terms of what they're able to do. And I hope that if there are positive things that they're able to accomplish, that can be acknowledged, even if it's from the other side, right? Because this is the problem we have, is we can't, it's become so hard to see the positive in the other side that we've become paralyzed by our polarity. And so, we're just going to have to start to see where, there's possible good on either side that might be beneficial. But it's going to be hard if we stick with the name calling and the demonization of the other side and not see other people as people. But I know it's sometimes easier said than done, given all the name calling that's going on and the types of characters that are displayed sometimes in politics and so forth. It's a mess. But yeah, I think it's also a very interesting time. All right. Well, maybe
Isn't that supposed to be a Chinese curse? May you live in interesting times.
yeah, I think you're right. Well, let's see how this wraps up then in this chapter. It says, therefore, the strongest armies do not conquer, the greatest trees are cut down. So even in the midst of these competing perspectives, the Taoists are saying, look, if you are on that side of the disciples of death, the companions of death, the followers of death, ultimately that strength that you're reaching for is going to be the thing that's going to be the ultimate downfall, because it cannot handle change. Fascinating story about this that played out. I don't know if you've seen the musical or the movie Fiddler on the Roof, but it in a sense deals with kind of the same idea, where it is following this Jewish community in Russia. Are they in Russia? I think they're in Russia at the time when there's a lot of revolution happening. And the main character, the father, Tevye, is very steeped in the tradition of his people, and it becomes the glue that holds everything together. But with that opening song, it's like, why do we do things this way? He's like, I don't know. It's just the way we've always done them. So he doesn't have a really good explanation for it, but it's important because it's the way that they've always done it. And then he has three older daughters, and each of them goes down a different path, challenging some aspect of that tradition. And so one of them doesn't want to go through an arranged marriage, but has somebody that she really likes that she wants to marry. The other one wants to marry, I think, a Marxist. And the final straw with the third daughter is she wants to marry a Christian. And so it just pulls at him, right, in terms of this challenge to tradition. And it's that holding on to and the strength of that is also the thing that is breaking, because and especially in the case with his youngest daughter, he disowns her, and it just tears the family apart because of this unmovableness. um, and then, of course, it's also set in the context of the Russian pogroms against the Jewish communities, and they're displaced. And so it brings in a lot of interesting things about change and tradition and how things evolve and how traditions can be positive, how they can be negative. So we've got a similar kind of question here, where that strength of something can ultimately be its downfall, and that flexibility would be the thing that the Taoists are saying is ultimately going to be more powerful and more conducive to life. And so, so the final line is then that the strong and the great sink down, and the soft and the weak rise up. And we could even think about this again like that yin yang, right? Like you reach that area of that strength, that stiffness, right? That hardness, but then ultimately it transitions into that newness. The control and the fixity then transforms into this newness, this chaos, this novelty that rises up in new life. And that's kind of the same cycle that we're seeing now too, which I also think is part of our political shifting, is that generationally there's big changes, right? And the changes that the younger generations are rising up with are a big threat to the traditional way that things have been. And I think that's part of where some of these battle lines are coming from. But here, there's that cycle, right? And ultimately, the old is going to pass. It's going to die. It's going to, wither. And the new and the young is going to rise up, and it's going to be still at this point of soft and supple. But of course, it eventually will get old too. And it's going to go through the cycle again. So, yeah. Interesting chapter. That line about the disciples of death and disciples of life is one of my favorites in the book. Uh, Interesting that it happened to fall on today with everything that's going on.
Yeah, it's very poetic. Um, yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of things churning in my head.
Yeah, I understand. I think we all do. Uh, but I'm rooting for humanity that we're going to find a way to embrace each other rather than try to do away with each other.
Yeah.
I actually take heart from something that I just read in one of Ray Kurzweil's books. Do you guys know who he is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's a a futurist. He's kind of the king of the futurists. He's been predicting um, technological trends using accumulated data since like the 1980s, and
He's one of the big proponents of transcendence too, isn't he?
well, transhumanism. Uh,
Transhumanism, yeah. Uh,
yeah, I don't know if he actually uses that term, but yeah, he's kind of the king of the transhumanists.
What's a transhumanist? Sorry if we have time.
Yeah, well, a few of his ideas are radical life extension leading to longevity escape velocity. His work has to do with the exponential nature of increasing technology, particularly information technology, uh, which is he coined the phrase the law of accelerating returns, which is basically that humans use technology to make better technology. And this is actually a process that's been ongoing throughout human history and actually throughout the evolution of the universe, if you measure it in certain ways, that there's been this very long, slow, exponential trend that is starting to get steep in a lot of ways. And if you plot, for example, the average life expectancy per year, it's been going up significantly for 100 years, and it's been increasing at a rate of less than 1 year per year. But theoretically, when medical technology is advancing so fast that average life expectancy increases at a rate of more than 1 year per year. In other words, for every year that you live, average life expectancy goes up by more than a year, then humans will have reached longevity escape velocity and will essentially be able to live indefinitely, thanks to the exponential rate of progress in biotechnology, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, all of these things that he says are going to reach maturity in like the 2030s to 2050s, what we would consider really high tech things. And he puts the mid 2030s at the point when the singularity occurs, which is kind of the turning point in human history when things are changing so fast that we can't imagine what's on the other side of that. We can't imagine what life will be like because it's so different. And he does this by plotting all these trends on maps about how technology evolves. And so he was able to predict very closely when the first computer would beat human grandmasters in chess, and when computers will reach a certain threshold of computability, and how long it'll be. I think it's like probably the early 2030s when the average $1,000 laptop will have more computational capability than a typical human brain. And it'll be a few years after that when the average $1,000 laptop will have more computational capability than all of the human brains on the planet combined, that sort of thing. But so his most recent book is called The Singularity is Nearer. He wrote one, I think in 2012 or so, The Singularity is Near. And just this 2024, The Singularity is Nearer came out. And the part that I just read, that I found very helpful is he talks a lot about the promise of accelerating technology, but he's also very clear-headed about the potential risks, the sort of AI is taking over everything, destroying humanity, the gray goo scenarios, the nightmarish super weapons and all kinds of things, environmental catastrophe and devastation. And the simple idea that I find hopeful is that is humanity's ability to respond to a crisis. We might be lazy and put things off if there's no immediate crisis, but when there is a crisis, we are capable of responding and adapting very quickly. It's part of our evolutionary nature that we try to conserve energy, but when we're forced to change, we can change very quickly, and
Mm.
that's the idea that I find most hopeful.
Yeah. There was and I think he also didn't he come up with like that first electronic keyboard, the Kurzweil. Uh and so yeah, he had an interesting background there. And I
He's
think
he's he's invented quite a bit of stuff, particularly in like the first speech synthesizer for blind people that could like read text and turn it into spoken sounds and stuff related to music. He's been the head of Google's AI department for a while. It was the only day job he ever had because he's used to starting and running his own companies. But Google said, "Hey, we'll give you a lab, we'll give you all these resources, we'll give you everything you want. Just come work for us." He was like, "Okay."
yeah, there
And
was
he said he did it because they have the best AI lab in the world, so that's why he took the job.
I think the reason I plugged in Transcendence there is I think there was a movie that came out a while back. I think it was Johnny Depp, maybe, where I think it was called Transcendence, and it was about how to upload human consciousness into a computer, which was one of the other programs that I think he might have been involved with at some point. But yeah,
That
interesting.
is something he talks about a lot.
Yeah.
We're gonna be able to do that by the early 2040s, he says.
Hmm. Interesting.
Scary
Well,
and cool.
I think we'll have to bring this very unusual episode to a close.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for joining. And if you'd like to be a part of our crazy conversations, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get a weekly email with the latest videos as well as links to our Friday morning Zoom conversations. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area where we meet in person, see you all next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.